Hi folks, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm here with my Mercedes. It's an ML Class W164 chassis vehicle, but today we're going to be replacing the alternator on the OM642. That's the 3-litre turbo diesel engine in this vehicle. Now, this OM642 is also on a number of other vehicles, C classes, R classes, GLs and Sprinter. It's a really tight fit. So we're going to take the alternator out from the top. So just looking at the parts and tools required to do this job, obviously I've got a replacement alternator. Now I've gone with a Valeo 439546 alternator. It's actually the supplier to Mercedes, so you get the exact same alternator, just without the Mercedes badge and the Mercedes part number. And that's about a quarter the price as if you'd get it from the Mercedes dealership, buying that online. Same part, just no Mercedes sticker. Then you're going to need some sockets. We've got the E-Torx there, and we've also got the E-Socket. So you're going to need an E10. You're going to need a torque bit driver. We've got the Torque 20. You've got a punch here. Now that's just to secure the tensioner. So once you've released the pressure off the accessory belt, and a bunch of sockets. You'll need a 17mm socket to loosen that tensioner belt. But apart from that, that's pretty much it. So let's get into this. So a quick overview of this job. Because we're working on the alternator, the first thing we're going to do is to actually remove the positive connection to the battery. Now you actually find the battery in this vehicle behind the right-hand front seat of the vehicle. And then we're going to come in under the bonnet. We'll get the engine cover off. Then we need to get the accessory belt or the serpentine belt tension off. Now, this is Mercedes, nothing's easy. So we've got to take the turbo outlet resonator off the vehicle just to get to the tensioner. Then we'll get the tensioner loosened off, locked in. We don't have to take the complete serpentine belt off. Then the alternator's down this side of the engine. It's really tight access, but we'll get the filter out, the air filter out, and that ducting out. And then with that out, we can get to the bolts to the alternator to actually get it out. Then we'll get the alternator out through the top. You've got that plug at the back of the alternator, the main power feed that comes back to the battery. Get those disconnected, and then we've got the alternator out, ready to get it in. And the reassembly will just be the reverse procedure. So as I said, to get to the main battery, it is behind the front right-hand seat. So you wind that seat all the way forward, lift it up, and then take out any mats. You can take out this bit of plastic here, and then that gives you access to the battery in here. All right, so let's get the engine cover off next. It's pretty simple. And with that off, we're going to get that turbo resonator off next, and we'll use our T20. If we have to, we'll take the Y intake off and that turbo outlet, that aluminium pipe there, but I don't think we have to. So we'll get the T20 in here, get that clamp off. There's a clip down the other side of that turbo resonator. There's two E10 bolts that secure the turbo resonator to the block. The one underneath is much longer. We'll get that out now. So you can see that long bottom bolt comes out of the bottom underneath that turbo outlet resonator. And it'll be a shorter one that's actually on top here. And now there'll be a clip which we need to undo, which takes off the back of that resonator there. Actually, to be honest, we can actually get to the tensioner pulley without actually undoing that clip to the bottom of the resonator. We can get to it here. So we'll get onto that with a 17mm socket, and we'll actually leave the turbo resonator connected to that pipe there. So with that turbo resonator removed, you can get a 17mm socket onto the tensioner there, and then you press down on your socket handle, which will just release the tension on that accessory belt. The neat thing about Mercedes, I've actually ended up using a 5 or 6 mil drill bit, is you actually got that hole in the side of the tensioner which you can push through, and there's a lug which then locks it in a loosened position. So importantly, we don't have to take the whole accessory belt off, but you can see we've just released the tension, and that'll be just enough to slip that accessory belt off of that alternator. Okay, so now to get down to the alternator, we've got to get this whole plastic airbox out. We'll get the ductwork out now on the front here off of that. So just pull that off around and get that out there. And then to get the actual airbox out, what we need to do is undo these clips here, just loosen those off. And then there's two E10s, there's an E10 at the front, one at the back. We'll get those out and then we'll be able to lift that whole airbox out. We'll just disconnect it up here like that. You can see the wide pipe will just pop off. You can see like that, and that'll get that airbox out. That's just going to give us a fraction more access to getting down to that alternator. So to get to that rear E10, we are going to have to remove a bit of the firewall panel. It's pretty easy. You just pull that rubber strip back like that. And then there's a number of 10 mil bolts. There's 1, 2, 3. And then that panel drops out, and then we'll be able to get down with that E10. And then with those two E10s removed, you should be able to just click the whole air filter assembly out. Just like that. So you can see with that air filter box and that tube now, we've got a lot better access into the alternator. I've just reached down and pulled out the control wire plug. And then we've got to remove the earth strap, and there's the main power feed that comes off. And then we'll get that alternator out. You've got those two bolts underneath the alternator which secure it to the block. We'll get those out first, and then we'll get to the top ones as well. So to get a bit more access into the alternator there, what I've done is I've just removed the intercooler pipework. That's the feed back into the engine. It's really simple. Just release that clip back there, pulled that off, and as you can see, that's really opened it up. We've got all three bolts out now, the two from underneath the alternator, that one on the top, the last one to get out. I've just left it in because we'll do it off camera to get the alternator out. I've also cut the cable tie on those connections because we haven't actually undone the positive yet that's at the back. I've reached down, pulled the plug out, so we'll get the alternator out now. Alright, so to get the alternator lifted up, we also had to take out the bolts that hold this little piece of plastic here, which is the intercooler pipework which is returning to the engine. We had to unbolt that from the engine block up here. It was 3 E10s and a torque T20 to get that out. Really wasn't that hard. Once you undid those bolts, it then slid out to the right there, and that's just giving us now just that little bit more access to lift up the alternator all of the way. Alright, so we've just wrestled that alternator, as you can see, out of that hole. We did have to push that plastic bracket for that intercooler pipework that goes back to the engine out of the way. And also we had to cut the cable ties on this electrical connection here. But with that all loosened up, we're able to get that alternator out. Alright, so having just got the alternator out of the vehicle, it was really difficult to film everything. But over the top of the positive connection to the battery was this little piece of plastic there, just stopping it from earthing out onto the body, I suppose, if anything were to drop onto it. So I simply pulled that off with a pair of multi-grips, just pulled straight off, and then I was able to get a 13mm socket onto the nut that's on that. Undo that. I also pulled off the D-clip connection which goes to the regulator of the alternator, pulled that off, and that's hanging down inside the vehicle. So let's now compare the old alternator to the new alternator. All right, so now that we've actually got the old alternator out of the car, as you know, I always like to really physically look to check that I've got the right part for the vehicle. Just looking at these two, you can tell they look absolutely physically the same. When you look at the Mercedes one that's come out, yeah, it's got that original Mercedes part number. I'll just read that out to you. It's a A642 154 0402 180 alternator, and it's made by Valeo, as I'd already in my research found out. Now I've purchased the 439546. That part number is actually not on the original alternator at all, but on the replacement, it's on the side, the 439546. However, when you look at the actual label, on this one, we've got a H543289A number, and that in very small fine print is actually on the original Mercedes sticker. I'll take a couple of photos and throw it into the video so you can see, but it absolutely, in my mind, confirms that we've got the source manufacturer alternator for this vehicle. We just don't have the Mercedes sticker, and for that privilege, we've saved a quarter or 3/4 of the price. We've only paid $490 for this alternator instead of the $2,100 from Mercedes dealership. All right, so now we'll get that alternator back in. It really is the reverse of taking it out. So we'll get that back in. We'll then get the 4 bolts that actually mount it up. We'll get the positive connection back on and that D plug back in, and then we'll bring you back and tell you and show you it in there. So as I said, it's just literally the reverse procedure to install the new alternator. You can see we've got that fastened in there, the 2 bolts on top that support it to the block, and then the 2 bolts right underneath the alternator that support it. We've got the earth on there and the main power cable at the back, and then we've got that D connector plugged in. What I'll do is I'll just show you a detailed view of this with the alternator that's come off the vehicle. So just showing you with the alternator off the vehicle, if it was rotated to the pulleys around towards myself, you can see you've got that main positive connection there, which had that plastic cap over the top. The earth strap went on this mounting bolt, so you can see those 2 mounting bolts on top. It then's got the 2 mounting bolts on the bottom and the D clip which goes in the back side there. But you can see we've also got that intercooler pipe work all back connected. That bracket we had to take off, that's all connected. So the next thing we just have to do is to release the tension for the accessory belt or the serpentine belt, and then to put that turbo outlet resonator back up to that aluminum pipe up there. So to finish it up, what we'll do is we'll push down on the wrench here, which is that 17mm, onto the tensioner, and then we'll remove that drill we put in, which will release the tension to come back onto that accessory belt, and then we'll have that tension back on and we'll get that resonator back connected. So just pushing down now. You can see we can pull out that drill bit there, and then I can release that tension back onto that tensioner belt like that. Now the main thing to do is we really need to check that that accessory belt is actually evenly in the grooves around all the pulleys. So I'll just do that off camera. That's really important. So we've got that turbo outlet resonator hooked up back to that aluminum turbo outlet pipe there. Final thing to do now is to put that air filter box assembly back in over here. So we'll get that in, and then it's time to hook up the battery and to give it a test start. And then don't forget to put this access panel back in here, which we removed to get to that air box, and also to put this rubber back into position. Otherwise, when you close the bonnet, it won't actually go down flush. So doing a job like this, obviously we've undone a lot of things and we've put back a lot of things. We took that turbo resonator off, we took the air box out, took that panel out, undid a bunch of electrical connections. We loosened that tensioner for the main accessory belt. You just want to double check that you absolutely have put everything back together at this stage of the job. So just having a really good visual. We haven't left any tools in. We've counted all our sockets, put them all away, and that everything's good at this stage. So just double checking all the connections, all of the electrical connections, got the air box in. So then the final thing to do is just to reconnect the battery of the vehicle, put the cover back in and the floor mat back into position there. So folks, just because I drove the vehicle over here this morning without the alternator running, I just hooked up my C-Tech charger. I just love the C-Tech battery charger. It's good for AGM batteries and it does that smart, intelligent charging. Just hooked that up to the battery for an hour or so after we finished and put everything back together before I've actually started the engine, because the last thing I want now is for the brand new alternator to be really charging that flattened down battery from the drive this morning. But it's all good now. We'll get the battery charger off and we'll give it a test start. All right, so let's start it up. And with that running, we'll just carefully just look around. That was the air suspension blew off, gave me a bit of a fright there, but let's carefully just look around the engine, just check that everything's looking okay. Just really important, as I do in all of my videos, guys, just to carefully inspect that everything looks good. So just having a really good look in and around the engine bay. Everything looks good. You can see the alternator down there working. No leaks, nothing. Everything looks good. What I'm going to do now is I'll grab a multimeter. We'll just check that it's actually charging. So with the multimeter, let's test now how it's actually charging. So we can just use the hose here that you jump start the vehicle with. So you can see 13.91 volts. It's absolutely charging perfectly now. So really good sign that our new alternator is just working perfectly. So the final thing to do, folks, is to pop the engine cover back on and we're good to go. So there you go, folks. That's how to change out the alternator on your OM642 turbo diesel Mercedes engine. And as you saw, this is actually in my Mercedes ML Class W164 vehicle. But you also find that same engine on C classes, R classes, GL classes, as well as actually Jeeps as well. So if you have liked the video, give us a like, drop us a comment down below. And in the future on the channel, if you're interested in learning about DIY, maintenancing and servicing and repairs on vehicles, on the channel we've also got the Audi A3, the early Ford Falcon and the Mazda 3. So if you're interested in any of that content, do subscribe to the channel. But until next time, have a good evening.